Good afternoon. This is Jacqueline Ganem DeFalco with the next episode of Cape Ann ARTWaves. This particular episode is actually going to premiere on June 20th, which happens to be Father's Day. So today we're going to have a very special surprise that involves the father of our artist. But I'm not going to give anything else away quite yet. So today's guest is actually Stephanie Benenson. But before I fully introduce Stephanie, let me just tell you a little bit about our show. I co-host this show with Christine Fisher. We both co-host and co-produce Cape Ann ARTWaves weekly, and we speak with artists who have worked and lived on Cape Ann. Our show is really targeted to tell deeply the stories of the artists here, and we could not be doing this without our generous sponsors. So I'd really like to thank Prince Insurance Agency, Christine Fisher, visual artist, the McDermott McCarthy team at Gibson Sotheby's International Real Estate, and also the Common Crow Natural Market. And to thank our musicians, Steve Lacey and Pat Verga, 1623 Studios, and our marketing partner, C Arts, who really gets our word out for us when these shows come out. And so with that, I would like to now dig in a little bit with our artist, Stephanie Benenson. Let me tell you a little bit about Stephanie. Her work is really different than anyone else I've interviewed so far, so I'm excited about today. Stephanie is a social practice artist, and we're going to learn exactly what that means. After attending Rockport High School, she pursued a BS in science at Tulane University, and then picked up on her early love of art, which you're going to really learn about right from the source, with studies at the Art Students League of New York and the National Academy of Design. After receiving her master's degree from RISD in 2017, she really went into a completely new part of the art world when she founded Harbor Voices, an artist-led community storytelling collective that creates public celebrations of a collective voice. With 15 plus years of arts education experience, her approach to social justice and inclusive community engagement practices is characterized by its unifying and connective power. Inclusive and accessible creative practices are at the core of her work. Historically, art and history have been represented by a narrow pool of storytellers. This inequity can be changed with the engagement and amplification of new voices and new stories. And I have to say that the timing of everything that Stephanie is doing couldn't be better. It's certainly a time when we need to tell stories and we need to unify. Stephanie's actual methodology is unique, the way that she tells the stories, and she does it actually in such a way that she's able to really get into the personal history of the people involved, but also in the context of local history in the greater community. She's presented her findings at the New England Foundation for the Arts Creative Community Exchange Conference in 2019 and was selected for a Creative Community Fellowship with National Arts Strategies. And I should say that was from the research that she did. And since that time, her work, which is public work that is free to the public to attend, has been generously supported through grants and private donations. And I was lucky enough to see her debut at Gloucester City Hall. And now she's shown her work across the North Shore in Salem at the Punta Urban Art Museum, Beyond Walls in Lynn, Powwow, and Worcester, and a very special exhibit at the Cape Ann Museum Green during the pandemic at the Gloucester Rotary. She's also worked out of the area and in Boston, and we will be able to see several examples of that work today. I think because these groups have been so important in her work, I do want to mention the Barr Foundation, the Mass Humanities, Essex County Community Foundation, and NEFA for their support of Stephanie's work. And with that, there's so much more to this. I want Stephanie to help us understand. So let's talk a little bit, Stephanie, about your journey to date as an artist. In your case, you grew up with one extremely influential artist in your family. Probably more than one, but I think one that we want to talk about today on June 20th Maybe you could describe your work. Describe a little bit about where your original influence would have come from.
Right. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Jackie. I'm very excited to talk a little bit about the work, but also the work in the context of Cape Ann art. Because as you said, I grew up in Rockport and I'm a graduate of Rockport High School. I, growing up, so I guess long story short, my family arrived on Cape Ann because of art, and we continue to live here because of art. My grandfather on my mother's side was an illustrator who lost his job when photography became the new hot thing for catalogs in Boston, and he left his ad agency and moved to Rockport and started watercoloring. And he was a watercolorist up until the day he died at 92 or 93 years old. He had a gallery in downtown Rockport, and my mom met my father when he had moved to Rockport to study painting from Hyde Park in Boston. So my connection to painting, particularly within Rockport, is runs very deep. I remember when I was a young kid running down to my dad's studio, and just seeing all of the work that he was doing, and he's hanging out with Dennis Flavin and all of these artists from Rockport, and they were taking all of these trips all over to paint these beautiful harbor scenes around New England, but particularly on Cape Ann.
Well, that's great. And I think this is a good place for us to insert a very special interview.
Okay, we're here in the studio with John Terelak, my father. We have a couple of questions here. Dad, where did you draw your inspiration from as an artist? And what do you want your art to say?
I drew my inspiration as an artist from years of learning the craft of painting and learning how to be creative. And that's an accumulated thing. You don't draw your inspiration from the minute you pick up a brush. But I was very fortunate because I was struck by the art muse at an early age when I was going to art school. And the poor girl made me work my whole life painting pictures. She wouldn't let me go. That's how I draw my inspiration, and I've been painting for 50 odd years, 55 years, and I can't wait to get to the studio in the morning. My inspiration, other than her, is years of going out painting, dreaming, intellectualizing on what subject matter and how I can do it and do it better than anybody else. And I try to make my next painting as better than the last painting. And there's lots and lots of professional things and intellectual things that you can do to improve your artwork.
So given all of the subject matter that you've covered in your artwork, we have seascapes, we have, just looking in your studio right now, we have cityscapes, we have Vermont farm scenes. Can you tell me a little bit about what some of your favorite projects have been, your favorite series?
Actually, my favorite project is disguised inside of the landscape or inside of the painting. But going through all the years, I think my subject matter relates to men at work. I look up here, there's this fisherman catching the fish, there's a horse sugaring painting, there are men at work and haying out in the field, there's a shipwreck with men going to the rescue. So basically the underlying subject matter is that the landscape is only a stage for the actors, whether they're fishermen or farmers or whatever, but that's the stage from, plus the harmonious colors that I try to achieve are many times more important than the subject matter. I'm painting a technique that is hopefully very interesting, and I'm painting color harmonies, hopefully that interest other people.
One of the things that, for me as an artist, that I am trying to do with Harbor Voices is to create a platform for people to have voice within communities. And also people like you're talking about, the people who are working on the harbors, the people who are working in the fields in some of your farm paintings, as well as all of the other people within the community around Cape Ann and in some of the other places. Do you see any connection between the work that I do with light and sound and your painting?
I haven't given that any thought, but off the top of my hat, the narration, personal intellectual narration that goes into the work before it's even put on the canvas or put in the camera is one of the more important things. I just don't pick up a canvas and start painting. I'd like to narrate the scene. And I think it's the same way with your light shows, that the narration should be very important.
Mm-hmm. What would you say is the single most important thing that you want to pay forward as an amazing and legendary painter coming from Cape Ann? What do you want your mark to be on the history of Cape Ann painting?
Well, in all humility, I would just venture to say that I just wanted to paint my whole life, that I was driven to paint, and what people make out of my artwork after I've gone is up to them. I know myself that I just love it, and when I get a really good painting, I put my nose right to the painting and I smell it, and I say, if you had to do it again, you couldn't do any better than this. When I pick up the next canvas, I try to make the painting better than the last one, always. And I put my canvases up on the wall, as you can see. They're stacked next to each other. They're competing for attention. They're competing to say, is this one as good as this one? Or why is this one not as good? And they're worked on.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you so much. We appreciate all of the work that you've done. And I'll just give a quick moment here to do a pass around the studio so we can see some of the remarkable work that you have, that you're working on in your studio in Rockport.
So obviously, Stephanie, the direction that you decided to take after really living in an art world that was, I would say, much more traditional. I'm very interested in, having watched all of the art world sort of around you, especially in Rockport. How did you decide to move into such a very different area? And also, you did it a little bit later in life. You didn't do it in college, really. So tell us a little bit about that part of your journey when you pivoted, and what sort of was your aha moment to then go back to school at RISD and study, and then wind up at this end of the art.
Yeah. So, I think I had always been very creative growing up, and had painted quite a bit, and was always drawing as a kid. I went through Rockport High School's art department, and I remember I ran into Haig DeMargin, who I think might be at Montserrat now. He was a teacher there, and then Mrs. Hilliard. And I remember all of my teachers from art teachers from growing up. And when it came time for me to graduate and move on, one of the things that my dad said to me, he said, "Don't be an artist. It's so hard. It's such a hard life." And I went to school, and I still took art classes and painting classes when I was at Tulane, but ended up on kind of a different journey that lasted for about, a year and a half after I graduated, working in advertising, and then decided that painting was really what I wanted to do. And so when I started painting, I went to the Art Students League of New York, mm-hmm. and also the National Academy of Design in New York City. And I started painting the things that I had always been painting and learned to paint when I was at home. So, seascapes and, some sort of Vermont looking landscapes and things like that. And as I started exploring the work, I thought to myself, there's so much about the creative process and about painting that I love, but I just don't know why I'm painting these things that I'm painting, right? And so I started asking those questions. Why do I want to paint and render a model that's, in a classroom? Or why would I want to take an easel and go out to a beach and try to paint a beach scene. Why is that important to me? And I realized that my connection to the work and to creativity was different than I think that my dad's and my grandfather's was. But that in a lot of ways, I think the development of my nonprofit Harbor Voices is very deeply connected to the experience that I had in learning about art through them. And I say that because I do think that in a lot of ways over time, the artists on Cape Ann, in painting some of the harbor scenes and the fishing scenes that they painted, were providing voice and platform for certain communities of people working on the harbor. And that they were trying to portray an aspect of history and an aspect of local culture that I think is very unique to Cape Ann. And so I do think that my work serves that conceptually, but it's just the medium in which it's presented is very different, right? So you can have an artist that can paint and can printmake and can make sculptures, but then maybe there's an artist that could also do it with light and sound. And so that's kind of the extrapolation that mentally I went through when I was at RISD. How do I take this voice that I feel like was fostered within me from a very young age and have some sort of, I guess it could be considered like a more of a contemporary and different portrayal of that.
Right. Well, I have to say, when you first talked to me about your ideas, when you were starting the project for Gloucester, I was really taken with what you were trying to do. Like it felt overwhelming when you described it to me, but the beauty of it is actually in its simplicity and its inclusiveness, in my opinion, but so I think this is a good chance to show a segment of the first installation. What year was that, Stephanie? Gloucester City Hall?
In 2017.
2017. Okay. So let's show that.
United States and Ellis Island.
My grandfather, who came over in 1888, and the manifest for the ship said he was going to Minneapolis. How he ended up getting rerouted to Cape Ann, we're not sure.
My grandfather immigrated from Sicily to come to Gloucester to own his own fishing boat with his father.
My grandmother was actually born in St. Louis. Her parents were in the United States and they gave birth to her so they can have an American.
Para mí sería mi madre porque ella es una persona que me ayuda en todo lo que necesito, me da consejos para cómo superarme en la vida y simplemente es una de las mejores personas.
Why don't you just tell us a little bit about how that evolved? And I imagine that was also a huge learning process for you doing the first one. So talk to us about what the goal of the project was. And then, if you would like to talk a little bit about what you learned that you have changed maybe even or evolved since then.
Well, so the project in Gloucester started when I got my master's at RISD. I received a grant from the Graduate Studies Department. That's a very competitive grant. And what they do is they choose a handful of students and they give them seed money to start their ideas when they've graduated. And so I had worked on this idea through my whole thesis. I wrote a thesis titled Anchored in Place, and it was about locational identity and new genre public art, or this model of social practice art. And so my idea was that if we could take these immigration stories coming out of Cape Ann and connect the historic stories from centuries ago and connect them to recent stories, that somehow in the sharing in the classroom, or we shared stories at Pathways for Children one night with a parents group. There were all sorts of nonprofits and wonderful people in Gloucester, and Phil Cook of Gloucester High School that participated in the work with his history students in Gloucester High School, and the mayor's office, and all over the city. And so if we could connect these stories from the past to the stories from the present, that in that connection and that sharing, that people could kind of open up an empathy and open up understanding and connection between people that may have not felt connected before. And that in those conversations, resilience is built in youth in particular. And that the research that I did when I was at RISD indicates that people that feel connected to the history of their immediate community, their immediate surrounding community, are more likely to become engaged in the betterment of the community and more socially active in the community, and it increases volunteerism. And so the idea was that if we can all connect through these stories, then we'll all be better off ultimately as a society.
It's really a very powerful thought. And so let's talk about any bumps you had along the way doing that project. That's something.
There were many bumps. So many bumps.
I know, but I'm curious. I think it'd be easier if maybe just talk in general about the process of doing one of these, and then we'll show another one because we want to show the one in Salem next. But just first talk about the process to create one of these installations and all of the what if scenarios, right? Because you're usually in a public place, sometimes you're outside, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the outdoor element is probably the biggest factor that gives me anxiety leading up to any installation, because when you're outdoors, you don't know if you have a lot of wind and the haze moves away from the light, it's very hard to see the lasers. If you have rain, maybe people don't show up. If you have a giant street lamp that's hanging over the installation, that dims the light and changes the complete experience. So particularly in Salem, when we were outside in the Illuminous Festival in Boston, when I worked on a project with Suffolk University, those were some like big things learning moments, I would say, for us. Yeah. But I think in general, for leading up to the Gloucester installation, I was so grateful to have this community of Gloucester and Rockport sort of wrap their arms around the project. There were so many, I can't even name all of the people. I mean, you were one of them, Jackie, that kind of came and I explained the idea to them. They said, oh, well, then you need to talk to so-and-so. And oh, you have to go, to the Historical Society in Rockport, and you have to have a conversation with so-and-so. And so there was this kind of, rabbit hole of following these stories and trying to find representation from all of the cultures that have come through Cape Ann over time, which there are so many, right? And so, you start off, talking to, I had a lot of, centuries old stories, and connecting those to people who had just arrived in Gloucester from Syria or from Haiti, and those wonderful stories as well. And so that, I think, was that was the biggest challenge for me, was sort of trying to navigate the landscape of the storytelling, that the possibilities, right, of cultural connections, because I think that in my opinion, Cape Ann represents some really wonderful, it's kind of a really wonderful melting pot in a way like that.
And Stephanie, speaking of diverse communities, we're going to now show the clip of the fabulous installation you did outdoors in Salem.
Vine aquí en el 1977, el 15 de abril.
I have to say, just the opportunity to go and see the murals and see them with the light shining on them with your installation behind it was pretty spectacular. And I remember it was freezing cold that night, if I can recall. So again, one of those things that can happen when you do an outdoor installation. What I was going to ask you though, is because it's not like, I need to really understand where you begin. Like, what is the process when you start one of these projects? I mean, you seem to have a methodology in place. And so just explain that, because it's so different than any other artistic process that I've discussed during the course of the show.
Sure. So every project that that Harbor Voices does starts with a community partnership. So for example, in Salem, it was with Punto Urban Art Museum, which is an affiliate of the North Shore CDC. And so they kind of sponsor the work in a way that they're the liaison with the community, and they have this established trust. and establish connections within a community. And then the other very crucial element in the very beginning is having a partnership with an educator. So I found that it's crucially important to the work to have a teacher or a professor or someone who really wants to wrap their arms around the work and kind of go dive a little deeper with me, with their students. Because it's very hard sometimes when you, especially when you're moving into a new community to collect stories, people don't know you, right? And you don't really know them. And I think that that's an assumption that I'm very careful not to make, is that I don't really know what this community wants to say or how these students want to portray their lives or their culture. And so you sort of hand over the microphone and say, you know, what would you like to say? And so having a teacher that has a very close relationship and established trust with them is very important to me. So we start off with, in particular, my most recent projects have had artist workshops where I will join in on a class, I'll zoom in or go to a classroom, explain the work, explain the power of public art as I see it, and then ask the students, you know, we're interested in creating this project about X, or what are you interested in saying? If you had an opportunity to have a light and sound exhibition that shared your stories, what do you think, what's the most pressing topic to you as a middle schooler in Worcester today? And their answer actually about 6 months ago was mental health and anxiety as it related to the pandemic. And so they said they all voted, and we had this Google survey where they all offered their opinions, and then we found a topic, right? And so once we had the topic, then comes the interview process, where either participants or students interview each other, interview elders, interview neighbors or teachers, or me as the artist will go out and interview people and collect all of this audio, right? So hours and hours and hours of interviews. I then go back to the studio and work with a wonderful sound engineer that I met that went to Berklee College of Music. And we go through, we clean up the audio, and we find the most poignant quotes within the stories and start to kind of bucket themes that people talk about within the work, and then try to connect people that might think that they have disparate views, but they might have similar threads within their storytelling. And so we create this sound collage, and the sound collage is about, 8 to 10 or 12 minutes long, and it's played on a loop. After the sound collage is made, we go then to the lighting studio, and we work to program the lasers in an overhead canopy experience to sort of create this meditative, deep listening experience. And the idea is that in many parts of an installation, you'll see this cross-hatching of lasers, one over the other, or connected lasers connecting overhead. And that's sort of visually supposed to represent sort of this connected web of stories and connected web of society. And then also there will be moments when it will be very calm and still, and you can sort of hear the voices, I think, a little bit more clearly when the light is very still and meditative. And so then we create the light show to choreograph with the sound collage. And that's sort of how the process works.
That's amazing. Well, you're generating a lot of interesting content along the way. What do you do with, because you can only hear so much in the sound collage. So what happens with all that other content? Because some of it is so educational, as you said, in the classroom.
Right. So every project that we do, especially when we're working with students, I always open up the dialogue saying, do I have permission to use your voice and your perspective for public art? And I give them an idea of what the installation will look like. Sometimes we do text projection. So I worked with an ELL class to develop these text projections of poetry, that they wrote a poem collaboratively together in an artist workshop, and then we projected the poem at Salem State, and this was last summer. And so I get permission from all of the storytellers to collect all of their stories for the purpose of art. So the work is, the stories, I have the stories, they may be used for art, but I haven't told them, I don't have permission to use them in other ways. And I think that, particularly the funding that I have for Mass Humanities sort of glaze over, and they weren't as interested in the work as interested as I was in the work. Yeah. And particularly, I think with oral histories and things like this, that this is a great way to reach a young student-driven sort of demographic. They have very short attention spans at that age, right? So if you want a sixth grader to kind of get an idea of this project and of this theme, it's important to keep it short and to keep it succinct in a way, if that makes sense.
No, I get it. So in the, it's I have a couple of different questions to ask you. One is, how do you measure your own success in these projects? Because you've invested a lot of time. I can't even imagine that any of these grants cover the amount of time that you put into making these happen, probably. And you can't sell this, so it's not art in that sense, in the commercial sense. So how do you measure success? Do you get, is it written feedback? Is there, just tell me, because you want to keep going, obviously. So tell us how that happens in this world, which is so unique.
Right. Well, first of all, to your previous point, we're very lucky to have a lot of grantors that have supported the work in extraordinary ways. And it's one of the principles from day one with Harbor Voices is every artist that works on any project involved in Harbor Voices gets paid. And I think that across the board, too often I see, and this might be part of me sort of just growing up in an artistic household, I do find in communities that people don't value creative capital as much as they should, and that they ask a lot of favors of artists and don't realize that there's a lot of work and creative energy that goes into everything that we do. And I do firmly believe that artists should be compensated for their work and not asked to give it away. So we do pay every single artist that touched the work. But that for me, when I find a project successful, I would say is the best example I have is from Gloucester, actually. So when I was working with Phil Cook's high school class, and I think it was probably 70 or so students shared their stories. One of the students, 2 weeks after our installation in Gloucester, or maybe 3 weeks, wrote an article for the Gloucester High School newspaper. And the title of the article was "Diversity Breeds Success." And it was a story about the high school soccer team, I believe, and all of the global representation of recent immigrants on the team, and how this student was creating this article that was exclaiming how important immigration and how important all of the diversity is to the success of his school and his experience and his educational experience and also his athletic team. So for me to have worked with these students in the classroom to talk about immigration history, how important it has been to Gloucester over time, to have them all share their stories or interview their grandparents and talk about immigration stories. And then a couple of weeks later to have that conversation continue and have a student create an article like that, to me is a measurement of success, because it means that someone has been reached. And I think that in Worcester, for example, with this work on teens and mental health, if one person came to that installation and said, you know what, I don't feel as alone as I did before, and I feel more comfortable asking for help now, then that means that project was successful. And that's the whole point, is that when you're connecting people through these stories, then they don't feel like they're the only one in the room that's, has something that they need to say, right?
Yeah, like I said earlier, your timing for these kinds of conversations is critical. And I really hope that you can find a way to involve more groups and people in this, because this is the time we're living in right now, right? Where we really have to have these conversations. So how would you counsel, I guess this is a two-part question, but one is, how would you counsel young artists to follow this path of public art? And also, what can people listening to this show do to become part? Like, where do you want to take this where other people can potentially help you build this and amplify the messaging?
Well, thanks. That's a great question. Thank you. I think that the advice that I would give to young artists that are sort of looking at the possibility for careers. When I was young, I thought that if you were a creative person, the only thing that you could do was paint oil paintings or watercolors. And I didn't realize, as young as I was, the breadth of creative opportunities that are out there for people. You know, and even just looking at, you know, the history of Cape Ann, you know, knowing that I went to Sigrid Olsen's store down in downtown Rockport on Main Street with my mom to get my matching beach towel and my matching t-shirt with my matching shorts, and how all of these creative opportunities for youth exist out there, right? And public art is one of those opportunities. But that places like Art Haven are so fantastic, I think, for young people, because it seems to me like they're really trying to show, if you have that creative urge and you want to go out there and make something, there are so many different pathways that you can take that are out there. And so that's the advice that I would give, is for people, for young people, to really think about it, and know that there are many options out there, right? And you never have to really, I mean, for me, when I committed to painting, I felt like, okay, so now I'm painting and I'm going to be a painter for the rest of my life. And then one day I realized that it wasn't really serving me the way I wanted it to serve me. And so to allow yourself that flexibility to change if you feel like you need a change. And in terms of Harbor Voices, the work, you know, I love volunteers. Jackie, I know you've been a volunteer with Harbor Voices before. And I think just through word of mouth in the Cape Ann community has been really wonderful for Harbor Voices. You know, we've had a lot of inquiries from people that are just follow the work and come to our installations, and that pass the ideas along. Almost every project that I've had has been from someone recommending me to someone else. So so that's a really I think a wonderful sort of vote of confidence, right, in terms of the visitor experience, at least I think so.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's interesting in thinking about this. I don't know if you've done it, but it would be fun to see some, you know, to see you talk about to these young people what is public, you know, how they can be involved in something like this. You know, I mean, to actually initiate it, right, as a career path for them.
Yeah. Well, I do every project that I do, when I do artist workshops in the classroom, it always starts with sort of about how this project came to be, what that experience is like for me, how other artists have approached public art, because there are so many different ways to approach public art. So I do feel like I have been sort of touching in small ways the people who have been engaged in the work.
You're proselytizing for public art.
Yes, exactly.
And believe me, we need that, because it's not readily understood by everybody. I think we have to realize that. So I think the last piece that we'll show will be what you did in with Suffolk University in Boston. And if you could just speak a little bit about that particular piece, and how that evolved, that would be a great way to wrap up today as far as the content of our interview.
Sure. Well, one of the things that I really love about this project that I did with Suffolk University is a dear friend of mine, Irini Marcos, who lives in Manchester, is a professor there. And we had been talking one day about the project in Gloucester. And she said, you know, you really should meet some of these students that I have at Suffolk. You know, it's such a remarkable place. And many students in her class were some of the first in their families to go on to college, but also a very, very global group of, I think it was an international marketing class that I worked with, a group of 20 or so students. And so we just started a project. You know, we heard from Lynn Burke of Illuminous that they were doing this project in Boston, called the Illuminous Festival, which was November of 2018. And so I worked with the students and collected their stories, and they did it in small groups or individually. And we created this work together that was immigration focused.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Stephanie. So we'll have an opportunity to see some snippets, some photographs from these installations. But I think with that today, we're going to close this episode of ARTWaves, which has been very special. And I want to make sure that I wish all the fathers a happy Father's Day today, especially John Terelak, who's going to be part of this ARTWaves interview. I'd also like to thank our sponsors once again, 1623 Studios, and also encourage everybody to look for us on YouTube, on the CArts eBlast, on Facebook, on Instagram. And of course, and Stephanie, I just need you to share with everyone how everybody can find Harbor Voices and get involved with Harbor Voices. If you could tell us the best way to do that, we'll show some things on the screen as well.
Yeah, sure. So there's our website is harborvoices.com. And on the website, there's very clearly a connect. You can connect to us very simply through a form on the website. And many do. So please do.
And following you on Facebook?
On Instagram, yes. So we're on mostly on Instagram at Harbor Voices, and then also on Facebook as Harbor Voices Public Art.
Great. All right. And thanks everybody. And we'll see you online. And happy Father's Day.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jackie. And happy Father's Day, Dad.